"Mom, if you sign that paper, you won't have a daughter anymore." Kayla Lopez said it quietly enough that the other customers in the bakery probably heard nothing, but to her mother, the words landed louder than anything else in the room. Teresa Lopez stared across the small table at her 31-year-old daughter, one hand still resting on the folder Kayla had pushed toward her untouched coffee. At 58, Teresa had spent nearly 3 decades building Lopez & Bloom, a modest but respected floral design business in Columbus, Ohio. She had started with wedding bouquets arranged at her kitchen table, then expanded into corporate events, hotel contracts, and a storefront that employed 11 people. Kayla had grown up among ribbon spools, delivery vans, and buckets of fresh hydrangeas, yet she had never wanted the business. At least, that was what Teresa had believed. Kayla had become a commercial interior designer instead, practical and independent, with chestnut hair usually pulled into a low ponytail and a habit of asking direct questions other people preferred to avoid. Teresa was almost her opposite. She was polished, composed, and so determined to keep peace that she sometimes mistook silence for resolution. That morning, however, neither woman looked peaceful. Teresa opened the folder. Inside was a copy of a property transfer notice involving the 2-story brick building where Lopez & Bloom operated. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "It was mailed to my apartment." Kayla tapped the upper corner. Her name appeared beneath Teresa's as a contingent beneficiary under an old family ownership agreement. "I thought the building belonged to you." "It does." "Then why does this say you're transferring it to Soto Development for less than the county appraisal?" Teresa closed the folder. "Because the business needs capital." Kayla leaned back. "You told me business was fine." "It is fine." "Those two statements don't fit together." Teresa glanced toward the counter, where an employee was boxing pastries. "Kayla, this isn't the place." "You picked the place." That was true. Teresa had asked her daughter to meet before work because she wanted to explain a decision she had already made. She had expected disappointment, perhaps an argument about sentiment. She had not expected Kayla to arrive carrying paperwork Teresa had assumed would remain private until closing. "Soto offered me a leaseback," Teresa said. "I sell the building, the company stays where it is, and I free up enough money to modernize operations." "For how long?" Kayla asked. Teresa hesitated. 3 years, guaranteed." "And after 3 years?" "We renegotiate." Kayla's expression changed. Not anger exactly. Concern. "Mom, Soto Development bought the furniture warehouse 2 blocks over last year. 6 months later, the tenants were gone and the building was converted into luxury apartments. This property is different." "Why?" Teresa had an answer ready. Soto's representative, Reese Soto, had been professional throughout the negotiations. He had assured her the floral shop was part of the neighborhood's character. More importantly, he had offered enough cash to solve a problem Teresa had told no one about. But explaining that problem meant reopening a chapter she had spent years keeping away from Kayla. "Because I negotiated protections," Teresa said. Kayla watched her for several seconds. "You're hiding something." "I'm handling something." "That's what you always say when you don't want me involved." Teresa felt the accusation because there was truth in it. After her husband, Kayla's father, died 12 years earlier, Teresa had made independence almost a religion. She handled insurance, payroll, repairs, taxes, and every crisis without asking her daughter to rescue her. Kayla had once admired that strength. Somewhere along the way, admiration had turned into suspicion. Teresa slid the folder back. "I'm not asking you to approve the sale." "Then why invite me here?" "Because your signature is required to release the beneficiary restriction." Kayla looked down at the signature line. "So this wasn't breakfast." "You needed my consent." Teresa said nothing. Kayla picked up her coffee, then set it down without drinking. "What happens if I refuse?" "The closing is delayed." "Delayed or cancelled?" Kayla. "Which one?" Teresa expationned. Cancelled, most likely. Kayla nodded slowly. Then I'm refusing until I know why you suddenly need this money. Teresa's phone vibrated against the table. She glanced at the screen and immediately turned it face down. Kayla noticed. Who was that? No one you need to worry about. Mom. The phone vibrated again. This time a voicemail notification appeared before Teresa could hide the screen. Kayla caught only a few words in the preview, but they were enough. Final notice. Payment deadline. Kayla's face lost its color. What payment? Teresa reached for the phone. Kayla did not touch it. She simply stared at her mother. You said the company was fine. The company is. Then what debt are you paying with the building? Teresa looked toward the window, where morning traffic moved steadily along the wet street. She had promised herself Kayla would never have to carry this particular burden. Now the document between them had made that promise impossible to keep. It isn't business debt, Teresa said. Kayla waited. Teresa lowered her voice. It belonged to your father. Kayla froze. Dad has been dead for 12 years. I know. Then how can you still owe money because of him? Teresa opened her mouth, but before she could answer, the bakery door swung open and a man in a charcoal overcoat stepped inside. He scanned the room, spotted Teresa, and walked directly toward their table carrying a slim black portfolio. Kayla looked from the stranger to her mother and saw something she had almost never seen on Teresa Lopez's face: fear. The man stopped beside them and placed the portfolio on the table. Mrs. Lopez, he said, I'm sorry to come here, but you stopped returning my calls. Kayla looked at the name embossed on the portfolio, then back at her mother. It was not Soto Development. It was the name of a private estate law firm. And beneath it was a handwritten reference Kayla recognized immediately: Lopez Family Trust, Confidential. The man introduced himself as Manus Payton, an estate attorney whose firm had represented Teresa for nearly 4 years. Kayla looked at her mother, waiting for an explanation that did not come. Teresa instead asked Manus why he had followed her to the bakery. He answered carefully. The documents scheduled for review that morning could not be postponed again, and after 3 unanswered calls, he had gone to Lopez and Bloom, where an employee mentioned Teresa was meeting her daughter nearby. Teresa clearly disliked that he had involved Kayla, even indirectly. Manus apologized, but his attention shifted to the transfer notice on the table. Has she signed it? He asked. No, Kayla answered before Teresa could speak. Manus seemed relieved. Teresa noticed immediately. Manus, this is not your decision. No, but I think she should understand what she is releasing. Kayla pulled the folder closer. That makes 2 of us. Teresa remained composed, but the control in her voice had begun to thin. She told Manus that the family trust was separate from the property sale. Manus replied that legally the matters were separate, but financially they were not. That single sentence changed the conversation. Kayla asked him to explain. Manus looked at Teresa first, respecting attorney-client confidentiality. Teresa could either authorize him to speak or end the discussion. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she gave a small nod. Manus sat in the empty chair beside them and opened his portfolio. 12 years earlier, shortly before Kayla's father, Kieran Lopez, died, he had created a trust containing several business interests and a life insurance benefit. Kayla had never heard of it. Teresa explained that Kieran had managed investments separately from Lopez and Bloom. She had believed most of his financial affairs were settled after his death. 4 years earlier, however, Manus's firm discovered an unresolved obligation attached to one of Kieran's former partnerships. Kayla immediately assumed that was the debt Teresa had mentioned, but Manus corrected her. Your mother does not legally owe Kieran's old partnership debt, he said. Kayla turned to Teresa. Then why are you selling the building? Teresa's silence became the answer before her words did. She had been making voluntary payments. Kayla stared at her. For 4 years? A little longer than 3. Why? Teresa folded her hands on the table. Kieran's former business partner, Martin Shaw, had guaranteed a commercial loan with him. After Kieran died and the partnership collapsed, Martin had been left responsible for most of the remaining balance. He later lost his business and struggled financially. Teresa had learned that Kieran had privately promised to protect Martin if anything happened to him, but the promise had never been formalized. Out of loyalty to her husband, Teresa began helping with the payments. Kayla could understand compassion. What she could not understand was selling a valuable building to honor an informal promise made by a man who had been dead for 12 years. Then Manus placed a photocopied letter on the table. There is another problem. The letter had been written by Kieran 6 months before his death. It referenced the partnership, the loan, and a separate account intended to cover his share if necessary. Kayla read the final paragraph twice. Kieran had written that if the account remained unused, the money was to go to Kayla. She looked up sharply. What account? Teresa said she had never found one. Manus had spent years tracing old records and believed the account had existed, but the money had disappeared before Kieran died. How much? Kayla asked. Manus hesitated. Approximately $480,000 at the time. Kayla felt the entire story shift beneath her. Her father had apparently set aside nearly $500,000, the money had vanished, and her mother had spent years paying an obligation she did not legally owe. Did Martin know about the account? Kayla asked. Manus said Martin claimed he did not. Teresa immediately defended him, explaining that Martin had been Kieran's closest friend since college and had never demanded money from her. The payments had been her choice. Kayla heard the loyalty in her mother's voice and wondered whether it was loyalty to Martin or to the memory of her father. Manus then revealed why the matter had become urgent. Martin had contacted his firm 3 weeks earlier and asked to meet with Teresa about the old partnership records. Teresa had refused. Why? Kayla asked. Teresa looked uncomfortable. Because I knew what he wanted to say. Manus corrected her gently. You know what you think he wants to say. Kayla caught the distinction. Before she could ask more, Manus removed a sealed envelope from his portfolio. Martin had delivered it to the firm the previous afternoon with instructions that Teresa receive it before selling the building. Teresa did not reach for it. I do not need another apology from Martin. It is not an apology, Manus said. Kayla watched her mother's expression change. Manus slid the envelope across the table. Teresa finally opened it. Inside was a single-page statement and a copy of an old bank transfer. She read the first line, then stopped. Kayla asked what it said. Teresa handed her the page without speaking. The transfer showed $480,000 leaving Kieran's private account 11 years and 11 months earlier, less than 4 weeks after his death. The recipient was not Martin Shaw. It was Teresa Lopez. Kayla checked the date, then the amount, convinced she had misunderstood something. You received Dad's money? Teresa shook her head. I have never seen this transfer. Manus said that was precisely why Martin had contacted them. The destination account carried Teresa's name, but it had been opened at a bank she had never used. Kayla's suspicion hardened into confusion. Identity fraud seemed possible, but Manus warned them not to jump to conclusions before obtaining certified records. Teresa asked whether the account still existed. No. It was closed years ago. Who opened it? Kayla asked. Manus reached for another document, then paused. The bakery suddenly felt too public for what he was about to say. He suggested they continue at his office, where he could show them the complete file. Teresa agreed, but Kayla remained focused on the document in front of her. Near the bottom of the transfer was an authorization code followed by the name of the person who had submitted the beneficiary verification paperwork. Kayla read it once, certain it had to be a coincidence. Then she looked at her mother. You said Martin was Dad's business partner. He was. Kayla turned the paper around and pointed to the authorization line. Then, why is his signature on the document that moved Dad's money into an account under your name? Teresa stared at it. For the first time that morning, she had no explanation. Manus quietly closed his portfolio and said there was one more thing they needed to see before accusing anyone. The signature was not the most troubling part of the record. The beneficiary verification had required 2 forms of identification from Teresa, and according to the bank archive, both copies had been submitted in person. One was her driver's license. The other was a document Kayla knew her mother had never carried. It was a passport issued in Teresa Lopez's name, bearing Teresa's birth date and personal information, but Manus had already obtained the archived application photograph. He placed the photograph on the table, and Kayla immediately understood why he had insisted they see the evidence before speaking to Martin. The woman in the passport photograph was not Teresa. Kayla studied the passport photograph until the unfamiliar face became more disturbing than the forged document itself. The woman appeared close to Teresa's age, with shoulder-length blonde hair and a narrow face, but there was no reasonable way anyone who knew Teresa could mistake one for the other. Who is she? Kayla asked. Teresa shook her head. I have no idea. Manus reminded them that the image came from an archived passport application associated with the identification used for the bank transaction. It strongly suggested fraud, but it did not prove who had orchestrated it. 20 minutes later, they were inside Manus Payton's downtown Columbus office, where privacy replaced the bakery's uncomfortable openness. Manus spread certified copies of the available records across a conference table. Kayla examined everything with the methodical attention she normally brought to design contracts. The questionable account had been opened shortly after Kieran's death using Teresa's personal information and an address on the north side of Columbus. Teresa had never lived there. Manus had checked county records. The archived address appeared to correspond to a property once associated with Sandoval Financial Services. Although one digit in the scanned bank record was difficult to read, Teresa recognized the name immediately. Kieran used them, she said. Kayla looked up. Teresa explained that Kieran had hired the firm for bookkeeping related to his partnership with Martin. She had met the owner only once at a holiday dinner years earlier. What was his name? Gerald Sandoval. Manus corrected one detail. Gerald had died 5 years ago, and the firm had closed soon afterward. Kayla asked whether Gerald could have created the false account. Manus said it was possible, but the records were not enough to establish that. More importantly, the transfer authorization bearing Martin Shaw's signature appeared genuine based on documents Manus had compared, although only a qualified examiner could make a formal determination. Kayla wanted to call Martin immediately. Teresa refused. Not until we understand what happened. Mom, you have been sending money to him for years. And he never asked me to. That does not make this less suspicious. Teresa's expression tightened. Suspicion is not evidence. Kayla almost argued, then stopped. Her mother was right. The facts were troubling, but Kayla realized she had already begun constructing a conclusion around them. Manus seemed to notice the same thing. He produced the payment history Teresa had authorized over the previous 3 years. The payments had not gone directly to Martin. They had gone to a loan servicing company connected to the old partnership obligation. So Martin did not receive Mom's money? Kayla asked. Not personally, Manus said. That weakened one theory, but created another question. If Martin had stolen Kieran's $480,000, why would he allow the partnership debt to remain unpaid? Kayla turned back to the original transfer. Where did the money go after it entered the account under Mom's name? Manus had traced only part of it. Within 48 hours, the money had been divided into 3 transfers. 2 went to accounts that no longer existed. The third, for $120,000, went somewhere unexpected. Manus slid a record toward Teresa. She read the recipient and stared at him. Lopez and Bloom? Kayla repeated. Her mother looked genuinely stunned. The transfer had reached the floral company 11 years and 11 months earlier, during one of the hardest periods in its history. Kayla remembered that year. She had been 19 and in college. After Kieran died, she had assumed the business survived because her mother worked relentlessly. Teresa now admitted there had been something else. Several weeks after the funeral, Lopez and Bloom received what she believed was proceeds from a business insurance policy Kieran had arranged. The amount was exactly $120,000. Teresa had used it to clear overdue vendor balances, repair a delivery van, and keep employees on payroll during a difficult season. "I thought it was insurance," she whispered. Manus had checked. No such policy had existed. The money that saved Teresa's company had apparently come from Kieran's missing account. Kayla sat back, absorbing the implication. Someone had stolen or redirected nearly $500,000, then quietly returned part of it to Teresa's business while hiding the source. Why would anyone do that, she asked. Manus did not know. Teresa suddenly stood and walked to the window. Because Kieran asked them to. Kayla turned toward her. Teresa explained that her husband had worried about Lopez and Bloom during the final months of his life. He knew the company depended heavily on Teresa and that his death would leave her balancing grief, parenting, and payroll. But if Dad wanted the business to have the money, why write that the account should eventually go to me? Kayla asked. Teresa had no answer. Manus did. Because we may be looking at two different instructions. He retrieved Kieran's original letter and pointed to the date. It had been written 6 months before his death. The transfer occurred afterward. Something could have changed. Manus had recently obtained an inventory of records from Sandoval Financial Services after the former owner's estate released old storage files for destruction. Among them was a ledger entry referencing Kieran Lopez, Martin Shaw, and something called the Harbor Arrangement. Teresa had never heard the phrase. Neither had Kayla. The entry contained no explanation, only a date 3 days before Kieran died and a notation, revised distribution approved. That was the first indication Kieran might have changed his financial plan near the end of his life. Kayla asked whether there was a revised document. Manus said none had been found. Then he opened a scanned ledger page and pointed to a handwritten set of initials beside the entry. "These are Martin's," Teresa said. Manus nodded. Kayla felt her earlier suspicion return, but Manus turned to the next page. A second set of initials appeared below Martin's, belonging to Gerald Sandoval. Then came a third signature, almost hidden beneath a faded bank stamp. Teresa leaned closer. Her face changed before Kayla could read the name. "Mom?" Teresa sat down slowly. Kayla followed her gaze to the signature. It belonged to a woman named Diana Brown. Kayla had never heard the name, but Teresa clearly had. "Who is Diana?" Kayla asked. Teresa remained silent long enough for Manus to answer. "According to the records I found, Diana Brown worked for Kieran and Martin's partnership for 9 years. Kayla looked at her mother. "And?" Teresa finally spoke. "And your father told me she moved to Arizona before you were born." Manus slid one final document across the table. It was a current Ohio property record. Diana Brown had never moved to Arizona. She was still living less than 20 miles from Columbus, in the same house she had owned for 37 years. Kayla could not understand why her father would lie about something so ordinary. Then she noticed Diana's date of birth and did the math. She would be 63 now. Manus nodded. Kayla looked again at the passport photograph used to impersonate Teresa 12 years earlier. The woman in that photograph would now be approximately the same age. Manus placed a recent driver's license photograph beside it. The hair was shorter and gray, and the face had aged, but there was no doubt. The woman who had used Teresa Lopez's identity after Kieran's death was Diana Brown. Teresa did not want Kayla confronting Diana Brown, and for once Kayla agreed without arguing. A 12-year-old financial irregularity involving false identification was too serious to approach as a family dispute. Manus recommended that they first preserve the records, request additional certified bank documents, and speak with Martin Shaw before deciding whether the matter should be referred to law enforcement or handled through civil counsel. Kayla appreciated the restraint. Every new document seemed to point somewhere different, and she was beginning to understand how easily suspicion could become certainty before the facts deserved it. Manus called Martin from the conference room. Martin answered on the second ring and agreed to come immediately when Manus told him Teresa had finally reviewed the records. 40 minutes later, a 61-year-old man with silver hair and a weathered face entered the office carrying an old leather document case. Teresa had not seen him in nearly 2 years. Their greeting was polite but distant. Kayla studied him carefully, searching for the confidence of someone who had hidden something for 12 years. Instead, Martin looked exhausted. "You saw the transfer," he said. Teresa nodded. "And Diana's identification." Martin lowered his eyes. "Then Kieran's secret is not staying buried anymore." Kayla immediately asked what secret he meant. Martin sat across from them and explained that the harbor arrangement was not a bank account or a formal trust. It was a private plan Kieran created during the final year of his life because he feared his business affairs were more fragile than Teresa knew. Kieran and Martin had personally guaranteed a commercial loan for a failed distribution venture. Kieran also knew Lopez and Bloom was under financial pressure. He wanted to protect both his family and his employees, but his available cash could not fully accomplish both. "So he moved the money?" Kayla asked. "Not exactly." Martin opened his document case and removed a yellowed envelope. Kieran had asked Martin and Gerald Sandoval to temporarily control the funds if Kieran became unable to manage them himself. Diana, who handled partnership administration, was supposed to prepare the paperwork. Martin claimed he signed a transfer authorization believing the money would enter an escrow account controlled by Gerald. He never knew an account had been opened using Teresa's identity until years later. "You expect us to believe that?" Kayla asked. "No," Martin said. "I expect you to check it." The answer surprised her. Martin continued. After Kieran died, Gerald told him that $120,000 had been transferred to Lopez and Bloom according to Kieran's final instructions. The remaining money, Gerald claimed, had been reserved to settle the partnership obligation. Martin assumed the loan had been substantially covered. Only years later, when the lender pursued him for the remaining balance, did he realize something was wrong. "Why did you not tell Mom?" Kayla asked. Martin looked toward Teresa. "Because by then she was rebuilding her life, and I had no proof that anything had been stolen." Teresa's voice remained calm. "But you let me start making payments. I told you repeatedly that you did not owe that money. You never told me why." Martin admitted that was his failure. He had been ashamed that Kieran's final financial plan had collapsed under his supervision. Then he revealed something neither woman expected. The old loan Teresa had been helping pay was no longer in danger of default. Martin had refinanced his remaining obligation 18 months earlier and had been making the required payments himself. Teresa frowned. "Then where have my payments been going?" Manus immediately opened the servicing records. The account numbers matched the old statements, but Martin said the original loan had been transferred during refinancing. Teresa's recent payments should have been rejected or returned. They had not been. Manus stopped speaking. Kayla felt the pattern before anyone named it. Someone had allowed Teresa to keep sending money toward an obligation that no longer existed under that account. Manus called the servicing company using the number listed on its official website rather than the number on Teresa's statements. After identity verification and several minutes on hold, he learned that the company had not serviced Martin's original loan for more than a year. The payment instructions Teresa had received were fraudulent. Kayla turned toward her mother. "How much have you sent since then?" Teresa calculated silently. "Nearly $42,000. That was enough to explain part of the pressure pushing her toward the property sale. Manus asked how Teresa received the payment notices. "By mail, usually. Sometimes email," Kayla asked whether she still had any envelopes. Teresa said several were probably filed at the shop. Manus told her not to discard anything. The discovery changed the entire situation. This was no longer only about something that happened after Kieran's death. Someone had been taking money from Teresa recently. Manus advised her to stop all payments immediately and contact her bank's fraud department. He also recommended preserving emails and reporting the suspected fraud after they organized the records. Martin appeared genuinely shaken. "I thought this ended years ago." Kayla looked at him. "What ended?" Martin hesitated, then admitted that Gerald Sandoval had privately confronted Diana about irregular transfers shortly before Gerald retired. According to Martin, Diana denied taking any money and claimed she had followed Kieran's instructions. Gerald never pursued the matter formally because he had incomplete records and declining health. But Diana used Mom's identity, Kayla said. "Why?" Martin opened the yellowed envelope he had brought. Inside was a handwritten note from Kieran. It authorized $120,000 for Lopez and Bloom and instructed that the remaining funds be protected until Kayla turned 30. Kayla's stomach tightened. She was 31. "Protected for me?" Martin nodded. According to the note, Kieran did not want Kayla receiving a large inheritance while she was still young. The remaining money was supposed to become available after her 30th birthday. Manus examined the handwriting but cautioned that it would need authentication. Kayla looked at the date. Kieran had written the note 4 days before he died. "Then where is the rest of it?" she asked. Martin answered quietly. "That is what I have been trying to find." Teresa stared at the note, then at the sale documents she had nearly signed that morning. The building did not need to be sold to honor Kieran's debt. The debt she thought she was paying had not even been receiving her money. Kayla asked Manus to trace the destination of the recent payments. He said they would need bank cooperation, but one detail might help. The electronic transfers carried a recipient descriptor. Manus enlarged the record on his computer. The name was not Diana Brown. It belonged to a limited liability company registered only 14 months earlier. Manus searched the Ohio business database and found the statutory agent. Kayla expected another unfamiliar name. Instead, Teresa stood abruptly when she saw it. "That cannot be right." Kayla leaned toward the screen. The company receiving Teresa's recent payments was registered through a business address Kayla recognized too. She had been there dozens of times as a child. It belonged to Lopez and Bloom's longtime outside bookkeeper, Susan Caldwell, a woman who had worked with Teresa for 26 years and still prepared the company's monthly financial reports. Kayla looked at her mother. "Susan knows you are selling the building." Teresa nodded slowly. "She is the person who told me I had no other choice." Teresa's first instinct was to defend Susan Caldwell. For 26 years, Susan had handled payroll reports, vendor reconciliations, quarterly bookkeeping, and the financial paperwork Teresa hated doing herself. She had attended Kieran's funeral, sent Kayla birthday cards through college, and once spent an entire Sunday helping Teresa reconstruct invoices after a computer failure. Kayla understood why her mother resisted the obvious conclusion, but familiarity was not evidence of innocence any more than suspicious paperwork was evidence of guilt. Manus advised them not to contact Susan until they had secured Lopez and Bloom's records. If Susan had access to company accounts, accusing her prematurely could complicate an investigation or cause records to disappear. Teresa called her store manager, Denise Parker, and said she needed access to archived accounting files for an insurance review. She did not mention Susan. By early afternoon, Teresa and Kayla were inside the small upstairs office above Lopez and Bloom's showroom, less than 3 miles from Manus's firm. Martin remained with Manus to review the old partnership documents. The floral shop continued operating normally downstairs while Kayla and her mother examined filing cabinets, bank statements, and printed reports. Teresa quickly discovered how much authority she had gradually surrendered. Susan did not control the company's primary checking account, but she prepared reconciliations, organized tax records, and advised Teresa about cash flow. More importantly, Susan had helped Teresa establish the recurring payments she believed were covering Kieran's old obligation. "She gave you the payment instructions?" Kayla asked. Teresa nodded. 3 years earlier, Susan had told her that a notice concerning Kieran's partnership had arrived with the company mail. Teresa remembered being surprised, but the account information appeared consistent with older documents. Susan had even cautioned her to speak with an attorney. Teresa had contacted Manus, but because she described the payments as voluntary contributions toward Martin's known debt, Manus had focused on whether Teresa was legally obligated to pay, not on independently verifying the servicing account. Kayla did not blame him. Everyone had been operating from incomplete information. "Did Susan know you were paying voluntarily?" "Yes." "And she knew you believed Dad had promised Martin protection?" "Yes." Kayla looked through a folder marked partnership correspondence. Near the back, she found photocopies of 3 payment notices. The formatting was professional, but something bothered her. The mailing address printed at the bottom used a post office box in Dublin, Ohio, rather than the National Servicing Company's headquarters. Teresa had never questioned it because loan servicing departments often used separate mailing addresses. Kayla photographed the documents for Manus. Then she noticed a handwritten note on one envelope, forwarded by S. Caldwell. That was the first direct connection between Susan and the notices, but it still did not prove she created them. Half an hour later, the situation became harder to explain. Teresa found an old authorization form allowing Susan to communicate with vendors and financial service providers on behalf of Lopez and Bloom. Attached to it was a photocopy of Teresa's driver's license. The copy had been made 13 years earlier, before Kieran died. Kayla stared at the date. "She had your identification." "For business filings," Teresa said. That was normal. "It also means Diana was not the only person who could have accessed your information." Teresa looked uncomfortable. Susan had worked occasionally with Gerald Sandoval when Kieran's partnership expenses overlapped with Lopez and Bloom events. That meant Susan, Diana, Gerald, Martin, and Kieran had all existed within the same small financial circle. Kayla realized the story was becoming more complicated, not less. Her phone rang. It was Manus. He had discovered that the limited liability company receiving Teresa's recent payments listed Susan as statutory agent, but Susan was not its owner. The ownership filing named another company whose members were not publicly identified. Manus was requesting the underlying records through appropriate legal channels. "So Susan may only have registered it for someone else?" Kayla asked. "Exactly," Manus said. "Do not assume more than we know." Then he gave them the first real break. Martin had brought an original partnership ledger containing a mailing address for Diana Brown. It matched the address associated with the false account opened in Teresa's name 12 years earlier, except the street number differed by 1 digit. Manus suspected a transcription error in the archived bank data and was working to verify it. If confirmed, the fraudulent account might connect directly to Diana rather than Susan. Teresa looked almost relieved. Kayla was not. Someone was still sending current payment notices, and Diana had been out of their lives for more than a decade. Kayla asked her mother when she had last spoken to Susan. "Yesterday afternoon." "About what?" Teresa hesitated. Susan had been reviewing the proposed Soto development sale and had urged her to accept quickly because the next supposed loan payment was due within 10 days. "Did she recommend Soto?" Kayla asked. "No. I contacted them myself." That removed another suspicious connection. Then Teresa remembered something. Susan had asked whether Kayla still held beneficiary rights in the property. At the time, Teresa assumed she was checking whether the sale required additional paperwork. Now the question felt different. Kayla walked to the locked storage cabinet where her mother kept older corporate records. Inside were incorporation documents, insurance files, and several boxes Kieran had packed before his death. One box contained old photographs and appointment books. Kayla opened Kieran's final year calendar and found repeated meetings with Gerald Sandoval and Martin Shaw. Diana's name appeared twice. Susan's appeared once, 6 days before Kieran died. Beside it, Kieran had written only 4 words, "Susan knows about Kayla." Kayla read the line twice. "What does that mean?" Teresa asked. Kayla did not know. There was no appointment time, no explanation, and nothing on the surrounding pages. Teresa seemed unsettled by the wording. "Your father and Susan barely spoke outside business." Kayla turned several pages and found an envelope tucked into the calendar's back cover. It was sealed but addressed in Kieran's handwriting, "For Kayla, after 30. Mother and daughter stared at each other. Kayla was already 31. Teresa whispered that she had never seen the envelope. Kayla carefully opened it. Inside was not a letter explaining the missing inheritance. There was only a small brass key taped to an index card and the name of a Columbus bank branch that had closed 8 years earlier. Beneath the bank name, Kieran had written a safe deposit box number. Kayla felt disappointment until she noticed a second sentence at the bottom of the card: "If the account is gone, the box will explain why." Teresa immediately called Manus. He listened, then told them not to visit the bank's successor branch alone and not to assume the box still existed after so many years. He would contact the institution and verify whether records survived. Kayla was about to put the card back into the envelope when she noticed faint writing showing through from the reverse side. She turned it over. Kieran had added one final instruction, apparently after the original note. It contained only 7 words, but Teresa recognized the significance immediately: "Do not let Susan open it first." Manus called back less than an hour later with information that made the small upstairs office feel suddenly too quiet. The bank named on Kieran's card had merged twice since the branch closed, but its safe deposit records had been transferred to a successor institution in downtown Columbus. Box 417 had not been abandoned. According to the archive, its rental fees had been prepaid for 15 years through an account established by Kieran Lopez. More importantly, the access restriction remained active. Kayla was listed as the person authorized to claim the box after her 30th birthday, provided she presented identification and the original key. Teresa was not listed. Neither was Susan Caldwell. Manus arranged an appointment for the following morning and advised Kayla to bring the envelope and identification. Teresa wanted to accompany her, but the bank representative explained that only Kayla and authorized bank personnel could enter the vault area until the box was formally released. That evening, Teresa canceled the proposed property closing in writing and notified Soto Development that she would not proceed while her finances were under review. The decision cost her nothing beyond time because she had not signed the final purchase agreement. She also suspended the questionable recurring payment through her bank and requested a fraud review. For the first time in months, she was taking actions based on verified information rather than fear of a deadline. Kayla noticed the difference. She also noticed that her mother had stopped defending Susan. The next morning, Kayla met Manus at the successor bank shortly after 9. A bank officer verified the historical file, inspected Kieran's key, and completed the required identity checks before escorting Kayla into the secured area. Manus remained outside because he was not authorized to enter. Kayla found the procedure strangely ordinary considering how much emotional weight she had placed on the box. Inside were 2 sealed document envelopes, a small ledger, and a compact voice recorder sealed in a plastic storage pouch. The recorder was an older digital model. A label in Kieran's handwriting read, "Kayla, listen after reading." Kayla did not play it there. She signed the inventory acknowledgement, placed the contents in a bank-provided security envelope, and returned to a private conference room where Manus waited. Teresa arrived several minutes later. Kayla opened the first document envelope. It contained copies of Kieran's financial instructions and a handwritten explanation dated 2 days before his death. Kieran confirmed that $120,000 was to be transferred to Lopez and Bloom. The remaining $360,000 was intended for Kayla when she turned 30. Gerald Sandoval and Martin Shaw were supposed to oversee the arrangement. Diana Brown was authorized only to prepare administrative documents. Susan Caldwell was not authorized to move or receive any funds. Teresa stopped reading. Then why did he warn you about Susan? Kayla opened the second envelope. Inside was a short memorandum describing something Kieran had discovered shortly before his death. Susan had approached him after noticing inconsistencies in partnership bookkeeping prepared through Sandoval Financial Services. She believed someone was using reimbursement accounts to move money between entities without proper documentation. Kieran initially thought Susan was accusing Martin. She was not. She suspected Diana. Kayla looked at her mother. Susan was trying to warn Dad. Teresa closed her eyes briefly. For an entire day, they had treated Susan as a possible architect of the fraud when Kieran's own records suggested she had discovered it. The warning on the index card suddenly meant something different. Do not let Susan open it first was not necessarily an accusation. Kieran explained in the memorandum that Susan had become emotionally invested in exposing Diana and had begun collecting copies of documents without authorization. He trusted Susan's concern but worried that she might confront Diana before the financial plan was secured. He wanted Kayla, not Susan, to control the evidence later. Then Kayla reached a sentence that stopped her. Kieran had written that Diana knew the account was ultimately intended for Kayla. So Diana knew exactly what she was redirecting, Kayla said. Manus cautioned that the memorandum still needed authentication, but its details matched records they had already obtained. Kayla turned to the small ledger from the box. The first pages tracked Kieran's planned distribution. The final pages recorded a series of account numbers and transfers. One entry showed the $120,000 sent to Lopez and Bloom. Another showed the remaining $360,000 transferred into two temporary accounts controlled through Gerald's firm. After that, the handwriting changed. Manus immediately noticed it. Someone else had continued the ledger after Kieran died. The later entries showed money leaving those accounts in smaller amounts over 18 months. Kayla expected Diana's name to appear. It did not. Instead, the ledger repeatedly used the initials SC. Teresa stared at them. Susan Caldwell. Kayla felt the suspicion return, but Manus stopped her. Initials were not proof. They needed the recorder. Kayla removed it from the pouch. The battery was dead after 12 years, but Manus's office had equipment that could safely power the device without altering stored files. They returned to his firm, where a staff member copied the audio file while preserving the original. The recording was dated 3 days before Kieran died. Kieran's voice was weaker than Kayla remembered, but unmistakable. He explained the distribution plan and named Martin and Gerald as temporary custodians. Then he spoke about Susan. Susan found the irregularities. If anything happens before I straighten this out, she has copies. Kayla looked at Teresa. Kieran continued. Diana had apparently admitted creating false reimbursement entries, but she claimed she had done so at someone else's direction. Kieran did not name that person. He said he planned to meet Susan because she had discovered where several transfers ended. The recording paused for several seconds before Kieran added something Kayla was not prepared to hear. Kayla, if you are listening to this years from now, understand that your mother knew none of it. Keep her out of the blame. Teresa covered her mouth. Kayla reached across the table and took her hand. Kieran's final recorded sentence was almost lost beneath static, but the restored copy made it clear enough. Susan has the second ledger. Manus stopped the recording. Kayla immediately asked what second ledger meant. Teresa looked toward the office door as if Susan might somehow appear there. Then Manus's phone rang. His receptionist said Susan Caldwell was downstairs asking to see Teresa urgently. Manus asked whether Susan had explained why. The receptionist relayed the answer. Susan was carrying an old accounting ledger and said she had received a call that morning from Diana Brown. After 12 years of silence, Diana wanted to meet Kayla. Susan Caldwell entered Manus Payton's conference room carrying a worn blue accounting ledger against her chest. At 60, she looked exactly as Kayla remembered from childhood, with short blonde gray hair, rectangular glasses, and the practical manner of someone accustomed to balancing numbers before discussing emotions. She stopped when she saw Martin Shaw. "So everyone finally knows," she said. Teresa did not offer her a chair immediately. "I know your name is connected to the company receiving my payments." Susan's expression shifted from concern to disbelief. Manus explained only what was necessary. The limited liability company receiving the recent transfers listed Susan as its statutory agent. Susan sat down slowly. "I registered that company," she admitted. Kayla felt her mother's hand tighten beside hers. Susan quickly continued. 14 months earlier, a man claiming to represent the loan servicer had contacted Lopez and Bloom about an administrative problem with Teresa's voluntary payments. He said the old servicing arrangement was being reorganized and asked Susan to file an Ohio entity that could temporarily receive payments while records were transferred. Susan had done so because the documentation appeared legitimate and because the instructions referenced account details she already recognized. "You created a company to receive Mom's money without telling her?" Kayla asked. Susan looked ashamed. "I told her the payment destination was changing. I did not explain that I had filed the entity because I thought it was routine administrative work." Manus asked who owned the parent company listed in the filing. Susan said she had never known. The documents had been supplied electronically by the supposed servicing representative. She handed Manus printed emails. He reviewed the domain name and immediately noticed it differed from the real servicing company's domain by one letter. Susan had been deceived. That did not excuse her failure to verify the request, but it changed the nature of her involvement. Teresa asked the question that mattered most. Where did the money go after it entered that company? Susan opened the blue ledger. She had asked herself the same question after receiving Diana's call that morning. The ledger contained copies of transactions Susan had tracked after Kieran's death, beginning with the missing $360,000. Susan had discovered that Diana moved the funds through several temporary accounts, but she could never identify the final recipient. Gerald Sandoval told her to stop investigating because the records were incomplete and because Teresa was grieving. Susan reluctantly complied, but she kept her copies. "Why did you never give them to me?" Teresa asked. "Because Kieran asked me not to involve you unless I could prove what happened." Teresa looked hurt rather than angry. "Everyone protected me by keeping me ignorant." No one answered. Kayla recognized the same habit in herself and her mother, deciding what another person could handle instead of allowing them to decide. Susan turned to Kayla. Diana's call had changed everything. Diana claimed the recent fraudulent payment scheme had been escalating in a way that seemed designed to push Teresa into a serious cash crisis. Force her to sell to Soto Development? Kayla asked. Susan shook her head. Diana had not mentioned Soto. She said only that whoever was continuing the scheme appeared to benefit from keeping Teresa under enough financial pressure to make desperate decisions. That meant the buyer might have been incidental. Kayla remembered that Teresa had contacted Soto herself. Whoever engineered the false payments could not have predicted which buyer she would choose. They only needed her to need money. Manus asked why Diana was suddenly talking after 12 years. Susan answered with the sentence Diana had used, because Kayla found the box. The room went silent. Kayla had claimed the safe deposit box only that morning. How could Diana know? Teresa asked. Manus pointed out that bank access records were confidential. If Diana knew, someone connected to the old arrangement was still receiving information. Martin looked disturbed. Susan looked frightened, but Manus refused to let speculation take over. He asked for Diana's telephone number and suggested any meeting occur at his office, with counsel present and no promises made. Susan called Diana back on speakerphone. Diana agreed to come at 4 that afternoon. She asked that Kayla be present. When Kayla asked why, Diana answered, because this started with her. The call ended before anyone could ask what she meant. That became the first question Kayla asked when Diana arrived shortly after 4. The woman from the false passport photograph was now 63, with silver blonde hair and a reserved expression. She sat across from Kayla and placed her purse beside her chair. Manus reminded her that he represented Teresa and Kayla, not Diana, and that she was free to obtain her own attorney before discussing potentially incriminating financial activity. Diana said she understood and had already consulted counsel. Her attorney had advised her not to admit anything beyond documents she could verify, but she had decided the Lopezes deserved an explanation. She acknowledged using Teresa's identifying information to open the account after Kieran died. Teresa stared at her. Why? Diana answered carefully. Kieran's original plan had been compromised before his death. Someone with access to the partnership finances had learned that $360,000 was being reserved for Kayla. Kieran feared the money would disappear immediately if left in the expected account. According to Diana, he instructed her, Gerald, and Martin to redirect it temporarily. Using my identity? Teresa asked. Diana lowered her eyes. That part was my decision. It was wrong. Kayla asked where the money went. Diana said most of it had eventually been placed in a protected investment account intended for Kayla, but the records had been deliberately fragmented so the person watching Kieran's finances could not trace it. Manus immediately asked for proof. Diana removed a sealed document packet from her purse. Before handing it over, she looked at Susan. Your ledger is missing the last page. Susan opened the blue book and checked the binding. One page had indeed been cleanly removed years earlier. Diana placed a photocopy on the table. It showed a final transfer of $328,000 into an investment account established 11 years ago. It showed a final transfer of $328,000 into an investment account established 11 years ago. The records indicated that the remaining $32,000 had been dispersed through earlier transfers, and Manus cautioned that they still did not have enough evidence to determine whether those losses were legitimate or part of the misconduct. The account had remained untouched. Kayla asked its current value. Diana gave Manus the latest statement. With years of conservative growth, it held just over $570,000. Kayla barely reacted to the number. If the money was protected, who has been stealing from Mom recently? Diana's face hardened. The same person Kieran was trying to protect you from. Martin asked for the name. Diana looked directly at Kayla. Before I tell you, there is something your mother needs to know. Teresa stiffened. Diana slid another document across the table. It was an old beneficiary form signed by Kieran. Kayla's name appeared beside the investment account, but beneath it was a condition none of them had seen before. Kayla read the sentence and felt her confusion deepen. The money was never intended to become hers. Automatically at 30. It was to be released only after she received a personal letter Kieran had left with someone outside the family. Manus asked who had been entrusted with that letter. Diana answered quietly. Susan. Kayla turned toward the bookkeeper. Susan looked genuinely stunned. Kieran never gave me a letter. Diana shook her head. Not Kieran. Someone delivered it to your office 12 years ago. Susan's expression changed as a memory surfaced. There was an envelope after the funeral, she whispered. I thought it was tax paperwork. I gave it to Teresa. Teresa stared at her. I never received it. Susan swallowed. Then someone took it before it reached you. Diana leaned forward. And that letter is the reason the recent payments started. Whoever has it knows exactly what Kieran left Kayla, and they have been waiting for her to turn 30. Manus did not allow the missing letter to become another excuse for guessing. He asked Susan to reconstruct exactly what had happened after Kieran's funeral. Susan remembered receiving a large cream envelope through Lopez and Bloom's business mail about 10 days after Kieran died. Kieran's name had been written in the return corner, which she found unusual, but grief had made everything unusual then. She placed it in a folder with documents intended for Teresa and left the folder in the locked bookkeeping cabinet. When she returned the next morning, the folder was still there, but she never checked whether every item remained inside. Teresa remembered receiving the folder. She did not remember the cream envelope. Kayla asked who else could access that cabinet. Susan named herself, Teresa, and the store's former office manager, Patricia Moore. Teresa immediately frowned. Patricia had worked at Lopez & Bloom for 6 years before leaving abruptly 11 years ago. She had not been mentioned once in any of the records they had reviewed. Where did she go? Kayla asked. Teresa remembered Patricia saying she had accepted an administrative job in Cincinnati. Mayna searched public business records and found something different. Patricia had remained in Columbus for at least 4 more years. More troubling, she had worked briefly for Sandoval Financial Services after leaving Lopez & Bloom. Diana reacted before anyone else. Patricia? Manus looked at her. Diana admitted Patricia had occasionally delivered documents to Gerald's office, but she had never known Patricia previously worked for Teresa. Kayla felt the scattered pieces finally beginning to overlap. Patricia had access to Lopez & Bloom's files, then later worked inside the accounting firm connected to Kieran's partnership. She could potentially have known both sides of the financial arrangement. But Manus again insisted on evidence. He searched archived corporate filings and found Patricia Moore's current mailing address in Westerville, Ohio. Then Susan noticed something in the fraudulent emails she had printed. The supposed loan representative signed his messages as Patrick Moore. She had assumed it was an ordinary coincidence. Kayla looked at Manus. Could Patricia have used a male name? Manus said they should not infer identity from a signature alone. He examined the email headers Susan had preserved and said a digital forensics specialist might be able to determine more. Before they could go further, Diana opened her document packet and removed a copy of an old reimbursement authorization. Patricia's signature appeared as a witness. Teresa stared at it. Why was my office manager witnessing partnership paperwork? Diana explained that Patricia had sometimes delivered records between Kieran and Gerald during the months when Kieran's health made travel difficult. That gave her access to documents containing account numbers, signatures, and details of Kieran's plan. The room became silent. Kayla asked the question everyone was avoiding. Did Patricia know about my inheritance? Diana nodded. She knew there was money reserved for you. I do not know whether she knew where it ended up. Manus contacted Patricia using a publicly listed number, but it had been disconnected. He then asked his staff to prepare the evidence for a formal fraud report rather than attempt an unannounced confrontation. Teresa agreed. She had spent years trying to solve problems privately. This one had grown precisely because too many people had kept matters informal. While Manus organized the records, Kayla and Teresa returned to Lopez & Bloom to search the archived personnel files for Patricia's old contact information. The late afternoon showroom smelled of eucalyptus and fresh roses while employees prepared arrangements downstairs, unaware that the owner was searching through 12-year-old paperwork upstairs. Kayla found Patricia's employment file in a labeled archive box. Her original application listed an emergency contact, her older sister, Deborah Moore. The address looked familiar. Kayla compared it with the false account records Manus had provided. The street matched. The house number differed by the same single-digit Manus had suspected was a transcription error. Mom, look at this. Teresa read it twice. The false bank account opened in Teresa's name had been associated not simply with Diana's records, but with an address tied to Patricia's family. That meant their earlier assumption about Diana's address had been incomplete. Kayla called Manus immediately. He checked the original archive and confirmed that the handwritten source document was difficult to read. The address could indeed match Deborah Moore's property. Suddenly, Diana's confession to opening the account did not explain everything. Someone else had apparently supplied the mailing address. Kayla asked whether Patricia could also have obtained Teresa's identification copy. Teresa pointed toward the old authorization files Susan had found. Patricia, as office manager, had routinely handled documents containing those copies. The possibility was becoming stronger, but still circumstantial. Then Kayla found a termination memo. Patricia had not resigned for another job, as Teresa remembered. She had been dismissed. The memo was signed by Kieran 11 days before his death. Teresa looked genuinely confused. Kieran told me she resigned. The reason listed was unauthorized access to confidential financial records. Kayla read the next line. Kieran had instructed Patricia to return all copied documents and office keys immediately. He knew, Kayla said. Teresa sat down. Kieran had apparently discovered Patricia accessing private records and removed her, but he had concealed the problem from Teresa while she was already coping with his illness. Kayla understood the intention, but the pattern was painfully familiar. Everyone had protected Teresa by withholding information until she could no longer protect herself. Manus called again. His staff had found something important in Susan's fraudulent payment emails. One attached payment instruction contained hidden document metadata identifying the original author. It was not Patrick Moore. It was Patricia Moore. The evidence was finally direct enough to include in the fraud report. But Manus had discovered something else. Patricia had died 18 months earlier. Kayla stared at the phone. Then she could not have sent emails 14 months ago. Correct, Manus said. Someone had used a document Patricia created before her death and continued the scheme afterward. That meant Patricia might have started it, but someone else was operating it now. Kayla looked through the personnel file again. A recent address update had been added years after Patricia left, apparently when an old retirement plan notice was returned. Beneath Patricia's name was an alternate contact authorized to receive administrative correspondence. Kayla recognized the surname immediately because she had seen it that morning on the property sale paperwork. The contact was Reese Soto. Teresa shook her head. That cannot be the same Reese Soto. Manus checked public records while they remained on the call. It was. The records confirmed that Reese Soto, who carried his father's surname, was Patricia Moore's son, and the same representative negotiating to buy Lopez and Bloom's building. Reese Soto's connection to Patricia Moore changed the investigation, but Manus refused to let a family relationship become a verdict. He added the new records to the fraud report and advised Teresa and Kayla to stop communicating with Reese directly. Teresa also formally withdrew from the property sale. Over the following weeks, investigators obtained records through proper legal channels while Manus worked with the bank holding Kayla's investment account. The evidence eventually produced a story more complicated than anyone had imagined. Patricia had discovered Kieran's plan shortly before he dismissed her for accessing confidential records. After his death, she helped Diana route the money through the false account, but Diana had believed Patricia was following Gerald's instructions. Patricia then retained copies of documents revealing where Kayla's protected inheritance had gone. Years later, facing financial difficulties, Patricia began preparing false servicing instructions that could redirect Teresa's voluntary payments once the legitimate loan arrangement changed, relying on Teresa's loyalty to Kieran to keep her from questioning them. The scheme remained relatively small as Kayla approached her 30th birthday. Realizing that the inheritance could soon become accessible, Patricia prepared fraudulent servicing documents for a more aggressive phase of the scheme. But Patricia died before she could put that phase into operation. While settling his mother's affairs, Reese found those files and later used them to continue the scheme, including the paperwork that led Susan to register the limited liability company. Instead of reporting them, he continued the payment scheme. Investigators determined that Reese became involved through Soto development only after Teresa contacted the company about a possible sale. He had not created her financial desperation, but he recognized an opportunity to benefit from it. Manus later explained that the evidence involving Reese was referred to the appropriate authorities and that recovering Teresa's lost payments would require a separate legal process. Teresa accepted that resolution without demanding instant justice. What mattered first was stopping the loss and protecting what remained. Diana cooperated through her attorney and provided records confirming that Kayla's investment account had been preserved. Her own decisions 12 years earlier were also reviewed rather than excused simply because she claimed protective intentions. Martin supplied his partnership files, and Susan turned over the second ledger along with every email she had received. Months later, Kayla's inheritance was legally released after the bank and Manus authenticated Kieran's surviving documents and completed the legal process required to satisfy the missing letter condition. The account was worth slightly more than $570,000. Kayla did not celebrate by buying a house or leaving her job. Her first decision surprised Teresa. She used a portion of the money to hire an independent financial firm to review Lopez and Bloom from top to bottom. The review showed that the floral company itself was healthy. Without the fraudulent payments, Teresa did not need to sell the building at all. Kayla then offered to invest in modernizing the business, but Teresa declined the money. "Your father left that for your future," she said. Kayla smiled. "Then let me decide what my future includes." They compromised. Kayla purchased a small minority interest in Lopez and Bloom at an independently appraised value, giving the company capital without turning the inheritance into a rescue. She kept her career in commercial interior design while helping redesign the aging showroom and upstairs office. For the first time, mother and daughter worked together without either one pretending she had to solve everything alone. Susan remained the outside bookkeeper, but her responsibilities changed. Teresa introduced independent account reviews and required two-person verification for significant financial changes. Susan accepted the safeguards without resentment. She understood better than anyone how years of trust could make ordinary verification feel unnecessary until the day it became essential. One Saturday morning the following spring, Kayla stood beside Teresa outside Lopez and Bloom while contractors installed the restored sign above the brick storefront. The building had not been sold. The employees had kept their jobs. Kieran's money had finally reached the daughter he intended to protect. Yet Kayla knew the inheritance was not what had changed her life most. She looked at her mother and remembered the sentence she had spoken in the bakery months earlier, when she believed Teresa was choosing a building sale over their relationship. "I said something awful to you." That morning, Kayla said. Teresa knew exactly what she meant. "You were scared." "So were you." Teresa nodded. "I just got better at hiding it." Kayla laughed softly. Then Teresa handed her a small envelope. Inside was the brass safe deposit key, mounted in a simple wooden frame beneath Kieran's handwritten words, "For Kayla, after 30. Kayla looked at her mother. "You kept the key? I thought you might want to remember what it opened." Kayla studied it for a moment, then shook her head. "It did not open a box." Teresa smiled. "No. I suppose it did not. It had opened 12 years of silence, misplaced loyalty, hidden mistakes, and assumptions made by people who believed secrecy could protect someone they loved." But standing together beneath the restored Lopez and Bloom sign, Kayla understood that the most important thing they recovered had never been sitting in a bank vault. Closing reflection: sometimes love becomes tangled with the instinct to protect, and protection can quietly turn into deciding what another person should or should not know. Teresa believed carrying every burden alone would spare her daughter pain, while Kayla initially believed finding the right person to blame would make the truth simpler. Neither intention came from cruelty. Perhaps that is what makes stories like theirs feel familiar. Trust is not always the absence of questions, and asking for proof does not necessarily mean loving someone less. There are moments when honesty may feel heavier than silence, yet sharing that weight can give relationships room to become stronger rather than merely appearing strong. In the end, Kayla inherited far more than money. She inherited a chance to understand her parents as imperfect people, and Teresa discovered that allowing her daughter to stand beside her was not the same as asking to be rescued. If you had been in Kayla's position, how would you have balanced loyalty to your mother with the need to uncover the truth, and what would you have done differently along the way?